Greetings, folks. Iolair back again with some additional thoughts on the build options for the new premium tier-VIII German light cruiser Mainz. So in the original video that I did for this ship, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description below, I did go through my ship build, including commander skills, and I did cover some variants on the skills that folks may want to consider, but I didn't go into quite as much detail as I originally wanted to because the video was already getting quite long. So I thought to do a follow-up and offer some additional input. And this also gives me a chance to respond to some of the really terrific feedback I'm getting from the community regarding both the video and the ship in general. So the tool that I'm going to be using for this video is a third-party website called the World of Warships Fitting Tool, and it has a few kind of neat options, including an artillery chart that covers the details around the artillery performance across all of the ships and nations, armor penetration, ranges, shell velocities, things like that. I'm not going to cover that in this video. That deserves its own discussion. But I am going to be using the fitting tool portion of this website where you can model different ship builds, cover the modules, the upgrades, commander skills, signals, and consumables. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the sort of the net influence of your choices on range, rate of fire, the turret traverse, torpedo speeds, various things that will have impact. In fact, it even has a little slider that will show you the influence of superintendent. So if I'm at 25% of remaining health, my 6-second reload comes down to 5.1 seconds on the Mainz. So you can do some pretty nice modeling things, and then you can save your choices as a link, which you can then save for your own use and also share with others. So that, and I've been doing this, I've been building a library of my different ship builds so that when folks say, hey, how did you build your Moskva or some other ship, I can just pull up a link and share that with people and they can immediately see what my different choices were. So for purposes of this video, I'm not going to be talking, the upgrades, I should say, are going to remain the same. Consumables, obviously the same. The only comment I'm going to make about signals is that you might want to consider the November Echo set to 7 signal, which improves AA a little bit. I didn't include this in the original review I did. AA, again, I think is perceived as pretty lackluster right now. So there's some question about the value of mounting a signal that may not offer much benefit, but that's something for folks to consider because the Mainz does have quite good AA, and this can improve it to an extent. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the commander skills, which is in the sort of central left portion of the screen here. And I've started with the core set of skills that I talked about in the original video with one difference. So in my original video, I recommended as the core 4 skills, priority target, adrenaline rush. I recommended demolition expert, and although for this video I'm going to start with superintendent, and I'll touch on a little bit why later, and then finally concealment expert. So those are kind of the core 4 to start with. I have switched it to superintendent based on some feedback that I'm getting from the community, and I was sort of mulling this over the last few hours. So one of the feedback points I'm seeing from folks is that they're not seeing that they're having any problems producing fires. The volume of fire that this ship generates is large enough that setting fires generally shouldn't be an issue. So there's some valid question about the value of taking demolition expert. And a number of folks have said, hey, I prefer superintendent to get the extra charge of the consumables. And that's a totally valid argument. We would have to look at data from thousands of games to understand how influential demolition expert really is or is not on fire production. But for purposes of this video, we'll be using superintendent as the core choice. So there's at least a couple different ways, directions you could take these skills at this point. One option, which is slightly controversial, but I think has some decent validity, is the choice of taking survivability expert to increase the HP pool from 42,500 to 45,300. So again, if you look over here on the right hand side of the screen, you can see that the hit point has gone up, and you can understand what the influence of taking that skill is. Now, this skill can offer a little bit of cushion in terms of additional health. It's not a substantial increase. It's only about probably about 7% in terms of an increase of hit points. I do know that Euro, among other players, are quite strong advocates of taking survivability expert on high tier cruisers that have repair party charges, because not only does the skill increase the base hit points, it also increases the amount of health that can be recovered, extending the overall effective hit point pool of a cruiser. So there's some solid science behind taking this, certainly for cruisers that have the repair party charge or consumable. For the Mainz, which does not have it, to me, it's a little less compelling of an argument, but I can understand that because she isn't as durable as the Hipper or certainly the Prince Eugen, and she doesn't have the repair party charge, that buffing up her hit point pool might be an argument to make. I think that it's a little excessive. It's a little too high cost for the value, but I think that for some players, they're finding that this is an effective skill for them. So that's one option to consider. This next option to consider is whether to take radiolocation. Now, this could be very useful, again, in sort of situations where you're hunting destroyers. I want to emphasize that the Mainz and the other tier 8 German cruisers are the slowest of the bunch of the cruisers at tier 8. They're not, on an absolute level slow. I mean, their base speed is 32 knots, which isn't terrible, but they're not going to chase down any destroyers. So use of this is more in terms of, isolating or perhaps cornering an opponent who's eluding you. And so I can see that this could be very useful in those types of situations where maybe you're cooperating with an ally to, sort of cut off an opponent that's trying to evade you. Again, the Mainz, with its very high rate of fire, is an excellent destroyer killer. And so having this skill to be able to isolate and find an elusive opponent, I can see could be very useful. I know a number of members of the World of Warships community that have used this skill on the Mainz, including Arun, who is one of the European community contributors, as well as Private Penguin, who is a German World of Warships streamer, among others, who have used this skill on the Mainz as a way to sort of track their opponents, especially if you're looking to be a little more of a closer support cruiser or in late game situations. So that's another consideration to make, is radiolocation. I mentioned the use of Last Stand. Again, that might be a useful skill for these tier 8 German cruisers, because they do have the tendency, or they have a reputation, I should say, of having their engines knocked out sometimes. So the other consideration to make is whether you want to use one of the other unique German commanders for the Mainz. So Friedrich Bonte is a quote unique commander. He's actually a legitimate historical commander like Günther Lütjens, but he carries no buff skills. So for purposes of a ship build, he's no different than just a regular commander. I did cover obviously the use of Günther Lütjens, and the main value there for me was the Iron Strike talent and being able to improve the reload. Again, I'm not going to go into him in more detail since I covered that quite extensively in the first video. Where it could be useful, again, is with these two fictitious, unique commanders, Franz von Jutland and Reinhard von Jutland, and taking advantage of their buff skills. So their buff skills are Vigilance and Jack of all trades. Now, I talked about jack of all trades in the original video. This is, I think, very useful for, especially for cruisers that are very consumable dependent, like the Royal Navy light cruisers that are very dependent on their repair party charges and their smoke to be able to execute the way that they do. But frankly, for any cruiser, because cruisers are support ships, having a way to get your consumables that are supporting either yourself or your teammates to come off cooldown more quickly is generally a good thing. And these unique German commanders, this skill reduces the reload time in the consumables by 10% instead of the normal 5%. So that could definitely be useful. And then the other buff skill is Vigilance. And this increases the torpedo acquisition from an additional 25% to 35%. And when you stack that on top of the German Hydro, gives you ridiculously good prediction or alertness of or alert of torpedoes that are sent by opponents. I have this commander on my Nuremberg because the Nuremberg tends to work a little better in terms of close support arrangements in some of these mid and lower tier matches. And having this skill, basically, you're almost always close enough to the destroyer when they're about to send that you detect their torpedoes, basically as they're physically coming off the ship. So you can't get any better detection than that. So for purposes of the Mainz, again, if you're looking to do sort of a destroyer hunter type of build, that might not be a bad choice at all either. And certainly this skill, if you're in situations where you're working from range and you've got some destroyers that send very long range torpedoes like a Sascha's or well, the Yoshino is not a destroyer, but it has the very long range torpedoes. This can also be a way to get early detection of torpedoes if you're milling around with your allied battleships and want to give them the benefit of your early torpedo detection as well. So this can be a very useful skill, I think, potentially for the Mainz as well. So that might be another choice to consider, is using one of these other unique commanders. It would be kind of interesting to take maybe at least jack of all trades and, I'm sorry, not jack of all trades, but take the Vigilance and the Radiolocation as a combination on one of these commanders, because then not only would you get the advantage of the Radiolocation to help sort of isolate your opponent, but the stacking of the Vigilance with the demolition, with the hydroacoustic search would make hunting those destroyers potentially even more effective, especially if you're having to sort of charge them down in their smoke. So a few different options for folks to consider. I also do want to take a moment here to respond to some of the really great feedback I'm getting from the community. So first of all, thank you very much everybody who's provided input and thoughts and feedback on the review, both in terms of their own experiences with the ship, as well as their thoughts about my communication to you about build options and just the review of the ship in general. I definitely get the impression that many people have very rapidly come to enjoy the ship. I think it's a little bit refreshing to, on a subjective level, to hear that a German ship is getting some love in the climate of World of Warships and the perception of Russian bias and maybe a lack of bias against German ships. So I'm thrilled that people have come to like the ship. I even got response from one of my viewers saying that my review was influential enough that they were willing to go out and get the ship. So I'm not responsible for your purchase, but thank you that I had such a positive influence on your decision point. So I certainly hope that you do enjoy it. For the folks that did buy the ship and were maybe influenced by my review, that you enjoy her as much as I have so far. So I think that's going to about wrap it up. Again, please do leave your comments below and any questions that you may have. I do read every comment that's posted to my channel. I respond to questions to the best that I can, and hopefully I continue to provide you with some good input and thoughts about not only this ship, but just in general. So with that, like I said, leave your comments below, and as always, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.